This is the kind of title that I put to the talk. Basically, just thinking of how, when we don't have like proper urban planning, we can get some communities of birds that might not be as attractive. I know that that could be like very anthropocentric kind of view, but it's also getting this idea of how urbanization, if it's not well planned, could bring this homogenization of the diversity and all this potential that we have in terms of human-nature interactions that we might be losing as well. Not only in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of how we enjoy the nature spaces that we have around. So, we all know here, I mean, Brisbane is, compared to many other cities, is a very green city, right? We still have a lot of remnant green spaces distributed in many different areas of the city, and thanks to that, Brisbane is, I mean, what we consider the local government area of Brisbane is the home to nearly 400 species of birds. So this is a very diverse city in terms of nature. I mean, it's also very diverse in terms of other groups of fauna, but we can find places in different areas here. I mean, these are the top places in terms of the number of species that have been recorded in the city. Like we have Tinchitamba Wetlands, Oxley Creek Common, Sandy Camp Road Wetlands, more than 200 species in each of those sites. And this is basically related to the great diversity that we have in terms of habitats, like different types of vegetation, water bodies, how well connected are those sites to other places that have remnant vegetation. So we can go to many of these places. I mean, I don't have at the top of my head the number of the species that we can get just here at Enoggera, but I'm sure it could be very, very close to this number. So in terms of diversity, I mean, we're very lucky. I mean, we can get like good diversity of birds and birds that are relatively easy to see if you are keen to explore more about this group of species, right? But when you zoom out, and then you start looking at Australian cities in terms of how this vegetation is distributed, you will see that we have like, this is Brisbane here. I mean, we are around here right now, right? And we are in an area that is well connected to all the areas of the Aguilar and then Enoggera. Of course, we have good vegetation surrounding here, but most of the green spaces in the city are actually remnant places that are relatively small, that are not well connected, and we are actually losing a lot of connectivity in many areas here that are in, I mean, areas like Norman Creek, Bulimba, all those areas in the south that are actually losing a lot of this vegetation, right? So when you zoom out, you actually see that we have a very fragmented kind of landscape, right, in terms of the urban spaces that we have available for bird species. This is actually, I mean, in terms of that fragmentation, when you think about ecosystem services, is kind of good in a sense because people can interact with a lot of green spaces that are relatively small, are easily accessible. That's one of the good things about Brisbane. But at the same time, we are kind of losing that connectivity and that habitat that is important for these species, and we are homogenizing what is happening here. So despite this high diversity, like that has been recorded in Brisbane, we need to start thinking, okay, how can we plan for the city, how it will grow in the future, right? In terms of maintaining these green spaces that are important for all of these species, right? So here's Brisbane, here is where we are. I mean, we are in a very lucky position here, a lot of opportunities to do like good revegetation, a lot of opportunities to create a sustainable community in terms not only of bird species, but also other taxonomic groups, and also in terms of the services that we can get from vegetation in these areas. So we still have a lot of opportunities here at the Gap. So why is it important to think about how is the spatial distribution of these green spaces in the city? So this is a bit technical now, but you know that it's not the same to have like a very large patch of vegetation that having like small patches of vegetation that might be interconnected. But just because you fragment a site, like this one, you might have just a reduction in the amount of habitat that is available for the species, right? So that's one impact that you can have. Even if you have two areas here that might have the same amount of vegetation in total, the species here might be more close to each other, might compete for these resources, might have more impacts from the matrix, right? More noise, or maybe some invasive species that could come here and compete with them, right? So that process, when we are having like these small patches of vegetation, even if we kind of maintain similar amounts of habitat, that's what we call fragmentation. Yeah? And there is a lot of theory on how we can manage fragmentation to actually protect biodiversity, especially in these human-dominated landscapes, like the one that we are here in Brisbane, right? And this is very important because we are living in a fragmented landscape. And when you are in landscapes that are fragmented, your interactions with nature change dramatically. So fragmentation could have effects on services like pollination or just some nutrient cycling, right? We can have, but fragmentation in theory could have these potential opportunities also for people to interact with nature more, because the spaces could become more accessible. That could be like a double-edged sword, right? It could be a problem because you might have more interactions from people, like getting to some species that might be more sensitive. I brought this here because, I mean, you can see here Victoria Park. This is like from 4 years ago, I think. And yeah, look sustainable, futuristic. Like we were gonna like work with nature, have all these places that are very nice, not only for people but also for biodiversity, right? Spending time with Offered Nature, like all these amazing words, and now you know what happened. And that's one of the main problems that we face, or challenges that we face, when we are actually thinking about the conservation of green spaces. So when we think about these challenges, I mean, and I think I'm gonna skip this one because I already explained this. This is a bit technical, but just so you know, like there is a lot of research showing how, when you have different sizes or the distribution of the green spaces in the city, that could have different effects in how people interact with nature, right? And people and nature. So coming back to this, to the city, we know that it's not the same. Based on that theory, like it's not the same to have like this big patch, like, yeah, that having multiple patches that are spread out across the city, so, right? And cities like Brisbane have an intermix of both of those types of vegetation structure, like in terms of what we call landscape structure. Landscape structure is like how we can have this vegetation distributed across different areas, right? It's not only having like one patch, but you can have multiple small patches. So how different land cover types or habitats are distributed in the space, right? So we need to think always not only, oh, we have our garden and our vegetation and then that's habitat. We also need to think about how that vegetation is related to other vegetation, right, in the city. So what would be best in terms of conservation, considering that cities have a low amount of habitat, right? I mean, the amount of habitat that we can actually protect is limited in cities, because obviously the main objective of cities is providing habitat for people, not for nature. I mean, that's a reality, right? So how can we manage these spaces to maximize, yeah, the provision of functions of these ecosystem services or the conservation of biodiversity, like bird communities? So the first thing that we need to understand is that bird communities are not just number of species, right? It's not just having like 100 types of 100 species or 200, as I was showing in the first slide. Is that these species are very different, right? You have species that will change in terms of their build morphology, right? And how they move and how they interact with their environment. If they are big, if they are small, how is their foraging behavior, so how they interact with different strata of the vegetation, right? So we are not only interested in maximizing how many species we can have, right? Because in many cases you can maximize the number of species, but could be those species that are already adapted to urban environments. And then you still have high diversity in some areas, but with the species that are very, very good at colonizing like these green spaces that are limited, right? So we need to think about like, okay, how can we actually maximize the conservation of biodiversity, but also thinking about the different characteristics of the species in terms of their diet or their morphology or their behavior, right? So we know that if you look, there is a lot of evidence from many different areas, and I will show you some from Brisbane as well, that, for example, depending on how much area of vegetation you have in one area, you will lose some species compared to others, right? So those species that are here, this is from tropical areas, but when you have a reduction in the number of, in the size of the fragments, those species that are in the top right corner for you will be lost, right? Compared to these species here that are small or that have all the type of morphology, right? So there are clear evidence of the relationship between the trait, the characteristics from the species, and the area of vegetation that you have. How big is your fragment? So what happens in Brisbane? In Brisbane, we actually have a different pattern. So this is something that we did some surveys 8 years ago now in different areas of Brisbane. All of these were areas that we selected to do some surveys in Brisbane. They had different levels of vegetation amount, different levels of fragmentation, how the spatial configuration of the vegetation was here. And then we just went and surveyed all of these landscapes to quantify the number of species, but also the type of species that we were finding in terms of their characteristics across all of these different areas. And then you can see we had some surveys around this area as well. And then, yeah, we tried to select areas that had high amount of vegetation, like the green here, low amount, the red one, and medium amount of tree cover in terms of that's the yellow color there. And this is, I promise, this is just one of a couple of graphs that I will show. So be patient with me here. But this is the amount of tree cover, so how much vegetation you have in a landscape. Yeah, in one of these squares that I showed you here. Each of these squares here, that's what we call a landscape. And then here, we have two traits. So species that are big or that are small, and then we have species that disperse a lot or that have very low dispersal capacities, that can move across different green spaces so easily. So we can see here that when you increase the amount of tree cover in this area, I mean, and here I'm talking about tree cover, but it's actually, we tried to select areas that had a high vegetation structure in terms of the different strata of vegetation. So this is correlated with tree cover in our study. So you can see here how the mean of body sizes in the community of birds tend to decline here, or it's smaller, in areas with more amount of tree cover, right? So you get more smaller species compared to areas that are here with low amount, but that are highly fragmented. So when you start getting high fragmentation in these areas, like very small patches of vegetation, right? That's when large species, yeah, like these dominant aggressive species in the cities start to be more abundant, right? So there is a clear difference in terms of the overall structure of the community in terms of which type of species you find. So you can have similar levels of species, the number of species that you get in one area, but the type of species is very different in these areas that have very low amount of tree cover, which is what we have, which is more common in Brisbane, right? And then that are more fragmented. So more fragmentation and low tree cover, like these areas here, that will produce communities that have a few species that are more dominant in terms of how big they are and how well they can disperse. So the takeaway message from here is that we're losing all these small little species like insectivorous or nectarivorous species that get lost in these areas that are highly fragmented. Yes? So we're talking about robins or the small honey eaters, so we are losing some of the what other species? Fairy wrens, it depends a bit, but they tend to be lost as well in these areas if they are highly fragmented. So small species. But the important thing is that when you look at this at the garden level, if you just look, instead of looking at a big landscape as I show you, like the squares that I was showing you, if you look that just at the garden scale and you compare different gardens, you won't see that difference so easily, right? So it's very important to see that even if you, in a garden, you might have relatively high diversity. If you ignore what is happening at the landscape scale, you might be actually, those species that are there might be just a remnant of the actual diversity that you could have at the large scale, right? So in the future, we might be losing those species that are in the garden. Like, it doesn't mean that if you don't consider what is happening at the landscape scale, that you have a resilient garden. You need to actually look at both scales, because you might be losing the species. When you look at larger scales here, even if you still get some kind of, if fragmentation doesn't show any effects at this garden level. So what are the implications of this? If we only consider these continuous patches, but that are surrounded by like a very hostile urban matrix, we tend to get like the same type of species. Medium, large size, high dispersal species. That doesn't mean that you don't get like small species. You can still get those, but they still are very dominant in those kind of patches. If you only consider maintaining this type of vegetation, that it's highly fragmented, but might be relatively well connected, those species also tend to colonize these areas, and you also get like community that is kind of homogeneous. And I will discuss this a bit at the end of the presentation in terms of, it's not only the amount, but it's also the vegetation, the type of vegetation that you have. So the first thing that we need to consider when we are planning for biodiversity in the city is actually like considering a mix. When you have a reduced amount of vegetation in the city, you need to consider a mix of large patches that are well connected, right? And that provide these habitats at the landscape scale. So you are not missing these kind of species, small size species, and low dispersal from the city in these human-dominated landscapes. So we published all of this in this paper, but the main thing from here is that the local management actions that don't consider landscape structure, how it affects the diversity of the species, may favor species that are already more adaptable. So if you start planting all this vegetation in one area and doing all these revegetation programs, and putting like these gardens where you have water and all of that, but you don't consider what is happening at the landscape scale, you might actually may favoring those species that are already highly adaptable in these urban environments. Okay? So now I'm going to talk about a second part here, just about the actual interaction that we have with birds in the cities. So it's not only about the diversity of these species, but it's also about the benefits that we get from these green spaces, right? So we know that from the green spaces, and I don't think I need to convince you here, that we get a lot of good things from green spaces in terms of human health and well-being, like in terms of building capacity, building relationships, reducing harms. We get this relational and collective kind of benefits. And all of that is based on this concept of ecosystem services, right? So there are the things that we think many times from green spaces, how they reduce temperature, like, yeah, they provide shade, or they help us to reduce effects of flooding, or they are good for biodiversity, right? But they can also provide all of these cultural services in terms of recreation or education, right? Or just the value that we give to a place in terms of our experiences, and that it's important for us in terms of the conservation, right? And one of those things that we can get from these spaces is bird watching, right? Like for many people, you will see that, and I'm assuming that this is kind of biased, because I mean, if you ask someone that goes and look for birds and really likes it, they would say like, yeah, this is bringing me a lot of joy, right? But if I ask some of you, oh, let's go tomorrow at 5 a.m. and try to like watch all these birds, it might not be like the same thing, right? So it depends. There are different levels of bird watching, but you can say that even just looking or watching one species of bird can bring joy for some people. Like even if you wake up and see something in your backyard, and for some of you, like, I really like magpies, for example. I think they are amazing, right? And it could be a magpie, or it could be a laughing kookaburra, or birds that are relatively well adapted to urban environments, right? You don't need to see like the most cryptid bird in one area. So even just watching one bird can bring you some joy, right? You don't need to become like this crazy twitcher to get all the nice things from the bird watching. But the reality is that depending on the type of bird that you see, that will give you like different types of experiences, right? It's not the same if I ask you like, oh, if I ask people like, raise your hand if you like more these birds compared to these birds. Like, who likes that? Yeah, but if I ask you, oh, would you like this more than those? I imagine like, yeah, most of you like will raise your hands. Or maybe you don't like birds at all, and then you can just leave it there. But for those who like it, yeah, I can ask you which colors you like more, right? Maybe, not the birds, but the colors, right? Or the shape. And then, the thing is that there is a lot of evidence and a lot of studies that actually look at all those traits from a species that can drive this attraction to birds in terms of the aesthetic attraction. And some evidence for different birds and studies in different areas of the world have shown that some colors tend to bring more positive reactions than others, or that the relative big size, for example, compared to the overall shape of the body is also important. So, and there is some studies for Australia as well, in terms of, oh, we know like, this is a survey that was done by Stephen Gardner. I mean, he's a very well-known ornithologist here from Australia. And they made this survey across, I think they interviewed around 700 people in Australia, asking them, oh, what are the traits that you find more interesting for birds? And they found that there were some specific traits that people find more attractive, and there was a classification in terms like what you find more colorful, or if the species have a specific pattern, right? Or if how melodious is the call, right? Or is it harsh, or they are just quiet. So you can also classify birds in terms of how attractive, their potential to be attractive, right? And we basically also took all those data sets that I collected from Brisbane, from all these different landscapes, and we analyzed if there was any change in terms of these relative attractive scores across the entire city. Like we compared different landscapes. And we found that the attractiveness score, I mean, I can give more details if anyone is interested about how we calculated this, but you can see how when you increase fragmentation and built infrastructure, you start getting the species that are more homogeneous and that have, the community in general have fewer traits that are considered attractive based on the theory that we know for all this information that has been collected in the past about what people find more attractive, right? So, this is the second graph that I'll show you, like that it's but just focus on this part here that shows how when you have more vegetation there in terms of vegetation structure, we found more species that were melodious, like that had these different type of calls that you can that are more diverse. There are also some differences in terms of color patterns. You don't need to understand all of this now, but the important thing is that there is evidence that some of the species that have specific traits in terms of what people find attractive are being lost in these areas that are highly urbanized. And this has implications in terms of not only how we are losing biodiversity, but also that potential that we might have of interacting with nature. And maybe for us or for the new generations, we might be thinking like, oh, I like to see just the butcher birds or the magpies, yeah, and these blue-faced conators, all those species that are relatively common and that are very cool, and I mean, at least I really like them. But we might be losing that potential of people to actually interact with other type of the species, yeah, that could bring other experiences. So, increase the diversity of vegetation structure that provide key habitats is very important because that's where we can get a lot of these colorful species with a high diversity of calls. So it's not only about we're losing diversity, we might be losing also that potential of human-nature interaction that has some very positive effects on human health and well-being. So just to finish, I would like to talk about like what can we do in terms of managing vegetation and bringing more potential of diversity in cities. So one thing, I mean, there is a lot of information and examples of how you can actually use planting biodiverse streetscapes. I mean, you don't need to have like this huge landscape or to revegetate and have improvements in biodiversity, but the reality is that these kind of landscapes are not very good for birds if you don't consider like the remnant habitat that you have around. But that's a good start, especially for other type of biodiversity like insects, of course, and those insects will provide some benefits in the future for other type of communities like bird communities. So we can think about this, but we need to consider landscape, right? And to consider those landscapes, we need to start thinking more about the conservation in terms of connectivity, how we connect the different landscapes, those different remnant areas of vegetation, right? There is information of how you can increase the potential habitat in terms of connectivity for different groups. I'm not going to get into the details here, but the main thing is that when you increase connectivity, you get more diversity, not only for birds, but also for many other types of taxonomic groups. So now, coming here to the gap, we have a very, I mean, we are very, very lucky in how this suburb is located, right? Look at all the vegetation that we have around. We still have a lot of vegetation continuum here, and we can maximize the potential of this vegetation to actually bring biodiversity here or bird communities that are very good in terms of all this diversity of different traits. So this is from, I think you must be familiar, or if not, there are many different resources online that provide information of what are the type of strategies that are good for improving bird diversity in urban areas. So one of them is the birds in backyards, right? And the main thing about this is not only about planting some vegetation, but creating habitats that are actually diverse in terms of the type of vegetation that we have, right? It's not only like having a lot of trees in one area, because actually having a lot of trees, what does is tends to encourage more like things like noisy miners or these species that are highly dominant to take over these places. What we need to have is more vegetation that is, I mean, a combination of grass and shrubs and obviously large trees that are important for some species. But to get to that point, we need to first have these two components that are clear in terms of assessing which vegetation. So if we are thinking about a project of revegetation in one area, we need to think about assessing what we have in terms of vegetation, maximize the potential of the vegetation that is remnant, then find the suitable location. For example, if you're thinking of a school, not only your garden, but at school, if you want to implement one of these projects of revegetation, not all the areas of the school will be suitable for that, of course. And then identifying which bird species are surrounding the school or are within the school, so you know what potentially could colonize these areas. And this gives a lot of opportunities for, I mean, what you were discussing in terms of, okay, maybe some kids will be interested in helping with this kind of projects and getting more familiar with the bird community that they have around, right? They don't have to go anywhere else. They can start just surveying birds. It could be just a little project with maybe once in a while, once per week, once per month, yeah, once every 2 months, just checking like which birds are around, and then identifying, like making that connection with the species that are around us. And if kids get more familiar with those species, I mean, for sure they will encourage more the conservation of these potential habitats. And then once we have assessed what is the potential of revegetation, we need to prepare in terms of the plant species and how we can plant those species. So there are different resources online. This is part of the Birds in Backyard program, the Australian Museum. I mean, there are other types of guidelines here, but for different types of birds, there are food resources, but the most important thing is that it's not only about planting this vegetation, it's also about like considering the habitat and what is surrounding that habitat, right? It's like, for example, gardens with tall trees and grass without shrubs are more likely to have these large aggressive birds. We need to avoid certain species, but as I showed before, we also need to consider the landscape in terms of the connectivity. I would say that for the Gap, this is a place that is very well connected, so we are already one step ahead, and you can start thinking about these projects at very local scales, and there is a high potential of having like good benefits and good outcomes just by thinking in the revegetation at the site scale, without considering too much what is happening at the landscape. So, yeah, if you're interested about this, just please feel free to contact me. I mean, I'm in touch with Damien now about this. I'm very happy to get involved more in any of these projects if you're interested, just to look in opportunities for improving habitat for bird species in the city. So please get in touch. We have some resources online as well in terms of the studies that we've done. And I'm just gonna finish with this one here, the implications. I think that it's very important for us to think that the urbanization not only affects the species diversity, but also the potential of those cultural services that are very important for us as well. That we need to think about like these species, not only in terms of, oh, let's have many, many species, but also which type of species do we actually want to keep here and to conserve. And yeah, if we consider this type of species and that potential for cultural services, we might be able to think more ahead in terms of how we can increase people's connection with nature as well, in terms of through these urban nature projects. So, well, thank you very much for listening.